Hi, welcome to Digital Badge Academy's webcast series. I'm Jim Daniels, your co-host, here along with fellow co-host and colleague David Leeser, who is going to kick off things today and introduce our guest. David, over to you.
Thank you so much. And we have a great guest. We're honored to have Mike Simmons from AACRAO. If you're not familiar with AACRAO, it's the acronym for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. And Mike, I'm not sure, and I think we met through One Ed Tech and the work that you're doing there with credentials, but I'm not sure people really know what AACRAO does and how it really factors in to this whole new movement toward alternative credentials and badges.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity first, and good to see you all again. So it's not a hard leap. Think of it. Ideally, in people's mind, they say registrar. The word credential should follow, right? If you just think about it traditionally, a registrar is in higher education, at least, and generally the person who is responsible for credentials. So it's not a real difficult leap to understand why ACRA would be interested. Um, Now on a particular campus, or we work with higher education mostly, but there are even registrars for. I don't know if IBM had a registrar, for example, but we know of some places who have a quote registrar for their companies, basically the person who's responsible for the credentials there. So that's mainly the side of our shop. We have admissions officers and registrars, and it's about an even split of those, but registrars are the ones that really were focusing in this credentials conversation.
I want to understand a little bit more about your background. I think, if I remember correctly, you used to be at University of North Texas. Have
That's
that
right,
right?
UNT.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So were you involved in the credentialing side of things then? Give us a little kind of background. I'm just real curious as to what sort of led you
Yeah.
into being associated in the world of credentialing,
Yeah,
digital
sure thing.
credentialing.
I was at University of North Texas, and I worked in the Teaching and Learning Center and worked in course redesign and things like that. And then about 10 years ago, we were looking at our SACS reaffirmation process, which is the accreditation process. And at that point, you had to come up with something sort of new or interesting. It's called the QEP, the Quality Enhancement Plan. And we were looking, well, what could be new and interesting? And we were at that point working with faculty on e-portfolios. And as I was telling you all offline, I got in a conversation with Pete Janzow at what was then Acclaim, and he started explaining this badge thing to me. And this would have been about 2013, and I had just hadn't been exposed to that, and I don't think there was a great deal of conversation about it, honestly, at that point in higher education. And that just sort of triggered something for us at the university, and we didn't jump into it immediately because it was way too soon for higher education. But that started the conversation, and as it evolved over the next couple of years, I was put in charge. I worked in the provost's office and was put in charge of basically developing this quality enhancement program. And we came up with what we thought would be a way to evidence learning differently. And we had originally leaned into an e-portfolio as a way of doing that. But this would have been in 2015, 2016. And so badges, credentials, digital credentials started creeping a little more. And I began to see people like David at IBM and others talking about this. And well, we thought, well, let's just pursue this connection. And it turned out, by the time we finished there and close to 2020, we had built out one of the first digital credential systems at a higher ed institution that was at assignment level. So it was not basically just you completed this class and you got a thing. It was at assignment level, and that's what we were attempting to do because we felt that was the most meaningful way to express learning, is to do it at that level. And that turned out to be a little advanced, and we were probably a little bit before our time. Now that's common. But 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that was, what are you doing? And so that's the background. I'm not a registrar, never have been, but I came to AACRAO because of this background and because of my interest in this whole credentials conversation that has now become so wide and varied. I never could have imagined this many people. There used to be about, 7 of us around a room at some point. Maybe, David, I mean, I've been to sessions where, 4 people showed up and things like that. And that's not the case now. I mean, everybody knows. Hundreds of institutions that we work with are dabbling in it. So yeah, that's the background how I got to where we are.
I remember I went to a conference early on, um, and it's the same amount of time and energy to go to a big conference and a small conference. And I went to this one conference, and I think there were literally 2 people in the room.
Hmm.
And a year later, I was at Mobile World Congress, and there were 4,000 people in my room, in my breakout session,
Yeah.
4,000.
Yes.
So it was talk about a dramatic change. So it is growing. But I guess the question I have for you then is, if you were to poll the AACRAO members,
Hmm.
where do they stand? Where do you think that I mean, we always thought, and I think you thought the same thing, Mike, that this was a long journey, right? I mean, it's like the evolution from analog to digital, for film or anything else. Where do you think it stands with the registrars and admissions officers?
Well, that's a great question because we just did a poll.
Oh,
Um,
wow, there you go.
yeah, this summer, and the report's getting ready to come out in a few weeks. Excuse me. But basically, the hypothesis of the staff was that, unfortunately, the average registrar was not very involved in this on a campus. We could name a few, and there are some very outstanding examples of folks who've been leading on this. But if you just went around and took a sample, the average registrar was just not high on the list. It doesn't mean they didn't know about it, didn't care about it. It's just not high on the list of things that a registrar needed to do, which includes all the things, keeping the systems, student systems running and registration and all the things that registrars do that are pressure and time sensitive. And so it was not so much an ignorance of it, it was a where does it fit? And that's what we found. It's not that they didn't know what it was. The other thing we found, and I hope you'll find this interesting, is language matters. So we've thrown out words here, digital credentials and badges and things like that. Well, what we did was we threw out to the members 6 common terms that we all just sort of use generically and interchangeably. We said, are you familiar with LERs? Are you familiar with CLRs? Are you familiar with digital wallets? Are you familiar with badges? Are you familiar with micro credentials? And are you familiar with alternative credentials? So that's sort of, those are the words that get thrown out. Interestingly enough, less than 10% of our members were familiar with CLR, LER, and digital wallets. And we thought, oh no, that's
Yeah,
not good.
yeah.
Well, then in the other words, 70-ish% more were familiar with badges,
Mhm.
micro credentials, alternative credentials, because that's the language being used on campuses.
Mhm.
Now, what we've got to do next is sort of look at does meaning matter? Because, those of us who've been in this know that CLR is both a technical standard and a generic name for comprehensive learner record. And it depends on who you're talking to as to whether it matters. And so what we're sort of exploring this language question, and I think it's important because what you call it it seems to trigger the person's response. So on a lot of campuses, and we had a session last week on this, I had a group of registrars and enrollment officers in it, said, how many of your campuses have micro credentials? And almost every hand went up.
Mm.
It's okay, that's great.
That's great.
Yes, except about half of their version of micro credentials was subsets of degrees. It didn't have anything to do with badges. It didn't have anything to do with the digital things we're talking about here. It was simply, we're going to offer a 3-course certificate that's a component of a degree,
Okay.
right? So a micro credential, even in academic terms, has a different meaning than what we would use in a conversation like this. And they were like, badge it? No, we're just talking about a paramedic certificate, and we call that a micro credential. Okay, so that to me is where a lot of the work is. And so people say, well, why is higher education so slow on this? Well, one of our hypotheses is because we don't know what we're talking about, in the sense of we use different words and by institution, by state. Some states, you look at SUNY or something, they're bad micro-credential policies. Well, when they mean that, they're talking about the world we're talking about here. But in other states, a micro-credential is simply a subset of a degree, a set of courses, or a non-credit program. And so until we get at that a little more, I think we're struggling. But that's a long way of getting around saying our members are sort of caught in the what does our institution call it. The second thing I want to point out is, the survey asks, so as a registrar, what role do you think you should have? Because one of the hypotheses we have is, okay, you are in charge of credentials, and a credential is simply someone in authority saying that you did something and I can validate that, right? That's a credential. And registrars have done that for hundreds of years. So on a campus, why are you or not involved? And why or why not are you involved? And we got interesting responses, and it split sort of down the middle, honestly. The registrar needs to be involved. Probably about half of the folks said they needed to be involved, and about a third said they needed to lead. But there were still about a third of the folks who said not necessarily needing to be involved, which we found and find interesting to see. And then the final thing is, okay, who on campus is doing it? And this is some other work we've got going on I'd like to talk about in a little bit. But basically, where on campuses are credentials being done? And the majority, frankly, are being done in the non-credit space, continuing professional education space, not in the academic programs. And so as a result, that's not an area that the registrar typically touches. And so, we've got some work going on there. So that's just, some examples of the situation we found is again, what you call it matters as to whether someone knows about it or is participating. And then the role seems to be dependent on where it is on campus, and B, the organizational location of the registrar, right? Some registrars are in a leadership role and others are in administrative, and they wouldn't naturally be brought in. But our overall, I think, organizational position is that's not great to be in a place where a registrar is not involved in a credential conversation. Doesn't mean they have to control it, but really, registrar. And so from an association perspective, I think our messaging is tending now toward, hey, at least become aware, and what can we do to help you become aware, and create resources and things like that to help them so they at least know about it and can be informed in the conversation. Whether they insert themselves strongly or just be aware of it, that's organizational choice.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that CLR and LER and digital wallets, were came with a little bit more ambiguity in terms of understanding. That definitely aligns to what we see. And in fact, it's interesting because I have talked to people who thought LER and CLR were essentially one and the same thing, and obviously they're not, right? But but yeah, I mean, I think what you call things does really matter, and that's something David and I have spent a lot of time talking about. It's one of the reasons why we get out and blog and create articles and things, to try and put some information out there to help define some of these terms a little more succinctly. But so what are some of the things that you think need to be done to kind of shift or to accelerate higher education's understanding of some of these more recent kinds of developments in the world of digital credentialing?
That's a great question. Before I answer that, I want to go back to something you just said. So your work in badging, right? The badging and work. Technically, badge can be a technical standard, like open badge standard, or it can be a descriptive of a transportation mechanism for a credential. So one of the things that we're trying to do is actually set some definitions. Not that we're the be all end all, but generally in academic credentials, AACRAO has been the person who said, here's what this is, here's what this is. And so we're trying to be sensitive to what words people are using, but also trying to put some stakes in the ground and saying, okay, here's a credential, and then there's ways that credentials are transmitted. And that seems to be something that most of our members can relate to. So even when we say digital credentials, well, a PDF is a digital credential theoretically.
Exactly.
So again, I'm just making the point that
Right.
we can, if we get stuck on the words, it's the wrong conversation. But we have to remember the words matter depending on who you talk to. So you just have to be aware that one person's this is another person's that. But to get to your question, it's interesting because you used the word accelerate. And in fact, that is the name of a project that we have going on. It's a higher education accelerator project. And we came up with that name just because of what the implication is that higher education is perceived to be slower or behind or not going as fast in the world of these kinds of innovative credentials. And so we have organized so let's think of it this way. On each campus, there's a set of stakeholders who could or should be involved in a credential conversation. And I probably will miss some, but obviously you've got the registrar. I mentioned continuing education earlier. You've got the folks in IT because there's a technical component. Lots of times student affairs professionals are doing student life type credentials. The career center is often involved, and if they're not, they should be. Obviously, you've got the faculty and the academic side of the house. In some instances, even the institutional research folks are starting to get involved. My point being, on campus, there are probably a set of 7 to 10 stakeholders who could and should be involved. But none of those would necessarily know that the other needed to be involved, is what we found. So if I'm in IT and the good folks at Credly come and sell me a system to plug into my LMS, that's just not a conversation I would naturally think, well, I need to involve blah, blah, blah. That's just a systems question. Or from a registrar, vice versa. But you get my point. But if we can elevate the idea that a more comprehensive approach to this would include all these people, because these are all the people who could potentially be doing this, rather than just you in the College of Engineering for this one little badge program you have, right? Or your leadership program in student affairs, or a career center programming, or whatever, that are often disconnected. More often than not, they're disconnected. So those stakeholders have national associations, if you think about it. So it's sort of like unions, right? You have union reps on the ground. You got electricians and carpenters and plumbers and things. We've got registrars, and you've got IT, and you've got faculty and others. And so what we've done is we've pulled together the coalition of national organizations, and it's the alphabet soup. It's AACRAO and NACE and AACNU and ACE and EDUCAUSE and competency-based education network and. So there's about 11 or 12 of us that we're pulling together and say, okay, all of our members are dealing with it in some way, shape, or form, and we're all pushing stuff straight down the pipe to them. Like we talk to registrars about registrar-y things related to credentials. And in student affairs at NASPA, they have a lot of conversation about non-credit student credentials. And at UPSEA, they have a lot of conversations about professional continuing education credentials. And they're basically, the traditional silo pipe approach that higher education has. And our logic is, okay, if we can, as national associations, come together, and the groups we have represent, we think, every institution and cover every student in the United States with this broad of a group. What can we do together to cross these silos, to break down these barriers, to make sure that our members are aware of a more comprehensive conversation at an institution that would benefit everyone? In other words, what we see, all of us see, is these things die on the vine. You get an individual champion, and you've probably seen this, individual champion building out a credentialing program of some sort in a unit or whatever, and it just is fine right there, and that's all it ever is. It cannot grow because it's just built on one particular premise, one particular program, or one particular infrastructure. And our working hypothesis is if we can generate a conversation nationally and sort of share that collaboration concept with our members, then we would empower them to have the conversations on campus and make sure that the registrar would know how to talk to the folks in continuing professional education, or that the folks in student affairs would know how to work with faculty in terms of the kind of governance and assessment that's needed to create a credential of value, et cetera. Those conversations are hard, and so they're avoided. But if we can nationally provide support for those scenarios, we think it will have a multiplier effect. I know it's a long answer, but that's a new thing that we're pretty proud of. We had our first meeting a few weeks ago. We've been talking on the phone for about a year, but we had our first convening about a couple of weeks ago, and the excitement was pretty real for the group. So I'm excited about that.
That sounds excellent. And I don't know, back to the speed of things and then acceleration. Yeah. I think about two different things. One was in the tech world, and one was in the education space, and the need for influence. And when I was, so I'm going to date myself a lot because I used to work for Lotus before it was IBM, right? And one of the things that we were trying to do, we would try to create this category called collaboration. And there was no category for collaboration at that point. Email was basically the only thing that was out there at the time. But Lotus came out with this idea of collaboration, and we had a very difficult time trying to push it. And so what we realized we had to do is we had to find the key influencers in the space. And one of the key influencers was the CTO of Southern California Edison, because we were in the energy sector and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Right? She got on board, and she dragged almost everybody else along with her because she really believed in it. She was out speaking about it. Of course, we had her at our conferences, but she was in all these other industry associations, and that changed it for us, having that one influencer. And then I think back to the 1990s, I guess it was Bill Clinton, or I think it was, pushed the SCORM standard, and that became the standard because that was a government push.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you think there's anything that's needed like that to try to get, with an influencer campaign or a government, is it a push-pull thing?
Yeah, you mentioned government, and it comes into a conversation like this. You look at other countries, and you guys know this, other countries have sort of a centralized credentialing authority or a person in government who does this. And, we're involved in international credentialing through the Groningen Declaration Network. And the weird thing is AACRAO is sort of the de facto credentialing organization for the United States. We're the one who get calls from the other governments and saying, because there is no federal government type thing here. Now some states are doing it. And so that's the news. It's neither good nor bad. I think what we find is, like most everything else in this country right now, it's right down the middle as to whether you want the federal government involved in your credentialing or not.
Yeah, right? That's right.
I think there are people who say if only the government would, and there are people who would say I don't want the government anywhere near my credentials. Right. Yeah. So I think that's not the first place to go. I think signaling from the government, but this is really happening at the state level, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a more important conversation at this point. I don't think it's really, my personal opinion is I don't think it's really possible at the federal level right now to do anything that pulls this all together and make one grand federal wallet or whatever. That's not where we're going. But at the state level, you see a number of initiatives where a state has determined that they want sort of integration of learning and employment records, and it's happening in that way, which means the state has decided we need some coordination of these things. I think the untested frontiers still remains identity and identity verification.
Yeah.
A wise person, and you know her, Sharon Liu, Jobs for the Future, said to me the other week something that I've taken to heart, and it didn't occur to me. She said, we can chase learning wallets, and this is not a quote, I'm paraphrasing. We can chase learning wallets all we want, but until the driver's license and financial wallets are solved on our phones, public policymakers are not going to chase learning wallets, which made perfect sense to me. We're still trying to figure out, is my driver's license going on here? And that's the public policy arena. And so when and if we solve the identity safety and security and confidence issues of those kind of digital records, I think that's when you'll have a different approach to this. But in the meantime, I think it is state. And so you talk about sort of the notion of champions and voice. I think the best at this point you can do is states. And one of the things we are trying to figure out our role in is coordination among and across states. So if we have the principle of interoperability, if that is a thing, then theoretically, when a state does something, it should interoperate technically and semantically with another state. That's turning out to be more true than not, but there's still the issues of this is our thing, and it's for our citizens, as opposed to, well, wait, what about the people who live in the town that's just across the state line? This happens a lot in government policy issues, but I think this has an opportunity to become regional, if not national. And there are regional economies that can be served by these kind of credentials that state level initiatives can handle. That to me is the next sort of step of scaling in terms of a public sense. I don't know what you think about that, but that's sort of where I've come down.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it just, it really underscores the potential behind this kind of coalition of organizations like you talked about earlier, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of to the point you made about there are people that, half the people are saying, I don't want government anywhere near my credentials. The other half saying, yeah, they would love that. Having this coalition and having that sort of drive this conversation and ultimately how it gets solution might be a way to kind of neutralize, those concerns in a way. It seems to me like you all are in a pretty good place to drive that conversation and that narrative and ultimately the solution behind it.
There's another angle to this, and it's sort of self-serving, but I think the value of higher education is under question. Whether it's we can just create an alternative credential and issue it, whether you're a company or an organization, because, quote, higher education is not meeting the needs of employment. That's a narrative that's out there. And then just generally the public, you see the numbers, the public trust and the public confidence in what higher education is doing is diminishing steeply. And I think there's honestly some legitimacy to that. Having been in higher ed for 26 years, I can see why the average person might say, what are you people doing over there? Right? But also having been in it, I know there's some very valuable work that faculty and education institutions are doing. And my approach has always been, and I've probably spoken to 100 faculty meetings about this, and you go into an academic department and you have what are you talking about? What the faculty would say, what is about, why would we do this? And my approach switched from because it's good for the institution to, well, first it's good for the learner. If you really are serious about students, and they all say, yes, fine. And then the second one is, it shows what you're doing. I mean, if you're really teaching, if they're really learning, and if what you're doing is valuable, don't you want to showcase that? That's what these kind of credentials do, because you're not doing it in a transcript. I'm just putting an A in your class and you barely get your name on there, and that shows nothing of your work. And so as a faculty member, this can show your value if you choose to do it. Now, the flip side of that is it can also expose your weakness if you're not careful.
Right.
But I think that's the narrative that we need to have in terms of explaining, at least to the academic side of the enterprise, why this is of value, because we've got to, whether you like it or not, demonstrate more of what's happening, what skills are being shown and learned, and how those translate into the quote real world that the average class doesn't make that translation. And this is particularly true in general education humanities, which is one of the areas I've tried to work in. I'm a strong believer that in general education, you build those foundational skills, which are called whatever, 21st century skills, essentials, all the different things. But where you get those in college is in these general education courses. And if a student understood that those skills in English 101 or Algebra 101, you're learning things like critical thinking and teamwork and communication in the most foundational way. and had that connection of you're building a base towards your whatever you want to do. My hypothesis is if they knew that, it would help us with the huge retention problem we have in terms of the value of general education. Now, that's a whole nother speech I could give, but I think there is some value to these credentials in terms of demonstrating the overall value of higher education and the specific value of faculty and programs within higher education. And that's to me, it's a motivating factor personally and professionally.
We found that to be true in the corporate space at every turn. When we introduced badges to our online big data university, we found that Jim did the data on it, but first of all, the number of people, the dropouts went way down. The completion rates went way up. But then we found that the average person after 1 year had come back for 3 different badges. And, before we even introduced badges, we couldn't get people to stick around to even finish the class.
Right.
So I have a question for you, around that. Are there some hot spots or some success stories in whether they're geographic or they're within, the higher education world, or, like, because we always seem to gravitate towards saying, well, the community college system is doing a whole lot better than the 4-year schools. But so what is true there?
Well, this is kind of like, when you're receiving awards and an awards show, you don't want to mention anybody because you'll forget somebody.
Right. That's right.
Having said that, I'll just throw out a few general concepts here. I live in Auburn, Alabama, and I'm familiar with the Alabama State Talent Triad system, which is probably among the most innovative. The state is about ready to issue a statewide wallet for all its citizens. I'm not aware that that's happening anywhere else. And so that's an example. And our specific work has been with the community colleges because they have the most direct to employment programs in the state has targeted needed industries, healthcare and manufacturing, right? So where there's an underemployment problem and how do we get workers in that space? Here's the programs, and does the wallet make that matching? And that's the full circle that an institution itself can't do. And that's the problem. The average institution can only deal with it. Hard to even deal with industries. They can deal with employers. And that one-off thing is great in the community, but it's not, the scale. And so you have this, I throw that as an example. And then there are states where they've been messing with this. I mentioned SUNY, this state system of New York, where they have create a policy for all their institutions to bring consistency so that employers and the public and students can know, okay, when we say this, it means this. And whether you're at school in upstate New York or wherever, they're doing something that has an equivalency to it. And I think that's meaningful. And then you mentioned community colleges earlier. I will posit that community colleges may be more appropriate and better for this kind of stuff we're talking about with innovative credentials, but I think they are not resourced well enough to do it, and that's a challenge, right? So it'd be no offense to my R1 institutional brethren and friends, I'm not sure that the average R1 institution needs this as much. And so you have to make a decision. So in our accelerator group, for example, the stakeholders of higher education, I think we'll come to a fork in the road where we say, okay, we can't, who needs to be targeted, who needs the help most, who could benefit from this coalition of resources? And my hunch is it would be, for example, a community college as opposed to a large R1 or flagship institution, just because of resources, if nothing else. It's not to say that the programs can't work at both types of schools, but just a resourcing issue. And so, back to community colleges, there are, we also get our friends at Alamo in San Antonio and the work that they're doing. They've done a nice blend of their online programming, their extended programming, matching with employers in the city there, and then their credentialing program. And to me, it takes that kind of integration in an institution as opposed to just, we're going to issue some badges and hopefully somebody will take them, right? They do it. They create credentials based on employer need. Now, again, is that scalable to every community college in the state of Texas at this point? No, but I have to mention in the state of Texas now has a micro-credentials initiative, right? That the university, the
Yeah, it's a
UT
model,
system is
right?
doing.
It's a
It's a
model that
model.
they use.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
template.
exactly. So I think there are a number of ways to scale if scale is the goal. But in terms of institutions that are examples, I've mentioned a few, and I could I could name more, but I was just trying to give examples of types of initiatives that we see that are happening. And then there are vendor-driven initiatives, where someone buys a certain product, and then that product implementation drives. Oh, now that we have this, then we can do this. And that, I think, that is another way that it happens sometimes if you buy XYZ credentialing platform or whatever. One of the areas that we struggle with, and I'll just go down this road for a second, is integration of systems. So we use a phrase called learning mobility, and it's relatively, it's not a new phrase, but we've tried to develop a catch-all because learning mobility means more than it used to. Moving a transcript from one school to another is the traditional way we think of, okay, transfer and all that. But what about when you're talking about skills? What about when you're talking about non-credit learning? What are you talking about? Continuing education, things that are not traditionally moved through academic records. Well, that's learning mobility, and we aspire to that, and we want our folks and others to be cognizant of the fact that you're moving learning, you're not moving records. Although learning moves through records, usually in systems, but those systems have to be interoperable. They have to have a focus on openness, in other words, as well, because I love vendors, and we are vendor agnostic and vendor neutral. We work with dozens of vendors in this space. But we emphasize to our members, ideally, what you have comes and goes easily and is not locked in. That's not always, possible. But I think this notion of being able to do that, that kind of transfer of learning, not in the traditional sense, but learning mobility is going to become more important. But it presents a challenge, for example, for our members. I say this in jest, sort of. Registrars don't do skills. Right? The average transcript doesn't talk skills. The average set of learning outcomes coming out from a faculty member in a syllabi is not expressed in terms of skills. So we have a lot of work to do in the back end. So it's not just a technical interoperability, there's a semantic interoperability that has to happen. And that is not, that's not gone real well so far in higher education. Yeah. So there's some work to be done there. Yeah.
Well, and I think, and there's a lot of work to be done on the part of employers as well, right? So, I mean, for all the, criticism that I've heard about, higher ed, not embracing parts of this whole digital credentialing movement, or like recognizing skills, deepening what is visible within transcripts and that kind of thing. Employers, by and large, are very ill prepared to ingest like alternative credentials. They're still sitting there, with a mechanism that is designed toward degrees and, or maybe certificate programs and things like that. And the alternative forms of credentials that come through, they're just very not in a good place yet. I think it'll get there. I think all of it collectively is going to evolve, right? Higher education is not going anywhere, right? And I think alternative credentials will find their place. I think badging, I think all of this will become more normalized and accepted. You did mention something earlier, though, that I think is kind of a big deal, and that's identity verification. I haven't seen the identity verification topic really get tackled in this whole space of badging and, recognizing, there's all kinds of learning programs out there, free learning, where people can go out and, maybe you go to Coursera and you pay a monthly subscription and you go all the way through. But, or you go to IBM Skills Build, or maybe it's Google's career certificate program. The identity verification is not quite there yet. So if you're an employer and somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got this, are they the ones that literally went through it? And I think that has got employers.
And higher ed has solved this using institutional identities, right? So as long as you're
Exactly.
working at IBM, you have an IBM identity. As long as
Right.
you're attending a school, you do. But once you leave that,
Right.
and I think that's where the verified credential concept comes in and is going to work. I want to go back to something that we were talking about just a second ago as well. In addition to the identity, you've got the notion of self-sovereignty. So right now, who owns a transcript? It's the institution. I mean, we can pretend like a student owns it, but it's a transactional thing. And so when we did this survey of our members, we asked, okay, is this a business model that you have, and do you receive a significant portion of your revenue from it? And the numbers were mixed. Probably about half said, yeah, this is basically our revenue model. We sell transcripts and we sell access to transcripts, and that's just the traditional way. Because what we've got to figure out is, at some point when a student owns a credential, it's theirs and it's verified, and you're releasing that. Basically, if I issue a badge right now, I can't control them, when they access it or whatever. So there's the credential itself, and there's the verification of the credential, and those things now are sort of connected through the issuer, right? The institution, I can control when they access it. What's going to change is when I don't control when they access it, and I'm just speaking generically as a registrar, for example, then they don't need me anymore, and the employer doesn't need me to they don't need that. There's no embossing the registrar's seal on the piece of paper anymore. And that's going to change the business model for higher ed and for us. And I think that's just right there. It'll change the business model of anybody who's in the transcript business. It's not a threat. It's just a change. And these are the kind of things that we have to prepare our members for is, okay, have you thought of? And here's some folks who have obviously, are solving for that. And there's problems. The other thing I want to mention is go back a couple of questions ago. You talked about employers not ready, and I couldn't agree more. For years we in higher education heard, if you would only teach students this, and you're not teaching students these skills we need, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be true. But the second part of it is and if we had these credentials that showed that, you could prove. That part of the equation is, I think, where you're saying is flawed. And we had a revelation, when I was at UNT, and I've stuck with this since then. Because employers are not ready, these records need to be about learners, right? Not about employers at this point. Maybe at some point the system advances and the ecosystem advances to where there's a direct correlation between the class I take and the employer I want. But right now, I think the best we can aspire for is to create really learner-centered records that empower the learner to showcase what they do. In education, the fancy word is metacognition, right? As a university or a college or a community college, what you want is your students to know what they know and why they know it, and to be able to express that. I mean, that's the whole goal of the thing. Well, what better way to do that than to be able to collect it in these kind of credentials we're talking about? That, to me, empowers the exact thing you're trying to do, as opposed to having them create a narrative out of A's, B's, and C's on a piece of paper or PDF. That's where we're failing. So I think, honestly, it could come back to the records themselves and how they are formed and created, and how the learner uses those in a way that then translates to the employers. So that, to me, is the bridge. If you create learner-centered records that empower and showcase what the learner can do and give them tools and narrative and evidence to do so in that record, then the employer's getting basically what they want, a bridge to that future, until we get to the point where, okay, all systems interoperate and it just goes back and forth. And I still think we're a good ways away from that. I mean, in the small town I live in here, I could go around town and I can't imagine how many employers in town here, for example, would even, their HR department would accept a digital credential. What are you talking about, right? So we're away from that. It doesn't mean the credential is not valuable and that a student couldn't share it. But in terms of system interoperability and ease, that to me is a longer term aspiration. If we can get records that a student can use productively and safely and securely, that verifies what they have and provides evidence and secures their identity, that to me is a goal that will go a long way. And we don't have to worry about this employer chasing, is what I called it. You know, each employer, each type of employer, each field, each thing. That's fine, but that is not a long-term growth strategy. I think that's my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone there. It's just my personal opinion.
Well, that's a great way to end this interview. Do you have any recommendation for people that are listening or watching on where they could go to get more information about the work you do? And you mentioned, a poll, or is there going to be any kind of published works that people can learn from?
Yeah, a couple of things. So we're doing the edits on the report, and that'll come out in mid-December, and then we'll do a whole set of sort of publicity and follow up social media and things on that report in January, February, and March, leading up to our annual meeting, when we'll sort of have the broad conversation with our members. And all the associations that I mentioned, the higher ed, have a set of resources related to credentialing relative to their specific function. So I'll put a plug there. But of course, AACRAO.org is our location. We have a new digital credentials community of practice, which is open to non-members. I know EDUCAUSE and One Ed Tech and others have similar communities of practice which are open. And that's part of the challenge, is if I'm in 6 communities of practice, it's confusing. So that's one of the things we're going to work on. But AACRAO.org is reference I'll point you to, and look for the Digital Credentials Initiative on there. That's probably the best place in terms of what our work is doing at this point.
That's terrific. So maybe we could have you back again in the future, talk about how things are going with this new accelerator program, and as you start to socialize results and that from the survey that you did, and it'd be fantastic if we could have you back and kind of dig into some of those topics, because I could think of 20 different directions we could go here conversationally.
Well, we should get a panel.
Yeah.
We had a panel on stage the other day with 7 of us, but they're from all the associations, and that was a pretty interesting conversation. So, maybe we'll do something like that.
That'd be terrific. Mike, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving up your time to spend with us today. It's been terrific. Thank you so much.
Valuable. Thank you so much for taking the time, and good luck with what y'all are doing. Really, really good work.
Are you looking to launch a digital badging program or improve an existing one? Look no further than Digital Badge Academy. Our highly popular online masterclass will help you gain the skills and insights necessary to achieve success. Enroll now and start learning today.